Let's do the antithesis now. I'll choose a blur. As you can see, we have got quite a number of different blur effects to choose from, but the one I use pretty much all the time is this Gaussian blur. Although, to be fair, sometimes I use the channel blur. We'll get onto that later. For the moment though, let's look at this Gaussian blur. I'll left click and drag this onto our clip now. Once I do, in my effect controls, yes, the Gaussian blur is in place, but by default it's set to neutral, i.e. 0. Now before I actually add any blur in, I want to open this up because I want to show you these options here. Blur dimensions. Presently it's set to horizontal and vertical, which will mean the Gaussian blur will have an effect both vertically and horizontally, as the name suggests. But you can change this by clicking on here, and you can choose to split this up so your blur only affects the horizontal or the blur only affects the vertical. Let's try it with horizontal and vertical first. So I'll left click on my drag slider and take this up to around about 34. What's that? 34.3? My eyes are going. Anyway, that's what it looks like as horizontal and vertical. Notice now though, as I change this to horizontal, the blurring effect of course now changes from both axes, horizontal and vertical, to just the horizontal. Can you see the difference? It's relatively subtle, but what you will notice is despite us using exactly the same setting, because we are only using the horizontal for blurring, then it doesn't seem quite as blurred. The same applies if I choose vertical, in that the same amount of blurring occurs as the horizontal on its own, but here vertical in isolation makes the blur depth to be not as extreme as vertical and horizontal in combination. Anyway, I'll revert back to horizontal and vertical, mainly because I want you to notice right along the edges of our image, horizontally across the top and bottom, and vertically across the left and the right. It's almost as if a bevel effect has been created. We sort of have a rounding off at the edges. Well, unfortunately, that's an inevitable side effect of using this particular effect. We can combat this by using this reset edge pixels down here, this checkbox. Once I check in there, notice what happens. In fact, just before I do, I'll take the drag slider to the extreme, so this bevel effect is much more noticeable. And then now, if I come down to the repeat edge pixels checkbox and check in there, well, as you can see, the vertical and the horizontal edges become that much sharper. And what's happened is, Premiere Pro has sort of grabbed some of the pixels that run along the edges and duplicated them, or repeated them, as it says, to negate that beveled effect around the edges. Like this, it becomes a little bit more crisp. If we can talk about being crisp with this particular effect, a Gaussian blur. Anyway, that's what that does. I tend to use this all the time, to be quite honest. Even though it doesn't come on by default, I will switch it on pretty much every time I use a blur. Let's just revert back. That's what it's like without, and this is what it's like with. Okay, so that's the Gaussian blur. As we can see, it affects the whole of our image, and in fact I'm just going to remove it because I want to try a different one now, so that you can compare the difference. So I'll right click on Gaussian blur and run down to clear. It's this one I want to use, the one I referenced earlier on, channel blur. What this is going to allow me to do is choose a specific colour, or a colour range anyway, within our video clip, and only blur that particular colour range. I'll left click on it and drag it and drop it on our clip. Therefore now within our effect controls we see channel blur has been added, and we have a number of different parameters that we can adjust. And for our purposes in particular, we can adjust the red, the green or the blue blurriness within this particular video. Let's try the green first of all. You can see some green across here, across the sand dunes here. Bearing in mind I'm not simply isolating this green area, this will affect the green tonality range right across the clip. But if you do adjust this fairly sympathetically, then it can be quite useful. I'll show you what I mean. In fact, I'll show you what I mean by going the opposite way. If I drag this too far to the right, then you can see this really does have a detrimental effect to the clip, to the point that it's unusable. But if I'm much more subtle with this, I'll drag it to the left and take it down to about 20. Now even this is too much, and in fact I do need to click in there to repeat our edge pixels. That takes away that pinkish purple border, and in fact if I take this down much lower, close to about 0, around about 5, then you can see that we can blur the green pixels within our range, just to make it more subtle. Let's try it now with the blue. Be aware though that this scene is predominantly made up of blue. There's an awful lot of sea, and there is some blue in the sky, but let's try it out. I'll drag this to the right. Maybe even at 22 this is too much. Certainly we've got the problem with the border again. It's much worse here, up in the 70s. So I'm going to actually click in the repeat edge pixels once more. To be honest, I wish this was a default setting, that it was always on. I can't think of an occasion where I wouldn't want it. Okay, now I'm going to take this down again. And in fact, I'm going to leave channel blur as it is. I'm just giving you a flavour of it here. So I'll come up to channel blur, right click and click on clear. Well, as we've just seen, using the channel blur filter does affect the whole of our image. Finally now, I want to show you this filter, anti-alias. What this will do is help combat any problems with jagged edges within your clip and sort of soften the edges off so we don't get such a distinct harshness to those edges. And in fact, if I come over to my viewing resolution, it's set at fit at the moment, so it automatically responds to the size my program monitor is. But if I increase this by clicking on here and changing up to 200%, i.e. doubling our clip's resolution, I'll be able to use the drag sliders here to navigate around and find an edge. And in fact, I think I'll take this up to 400%, 4 times the clip's resolution, so that we can see this much more prominently. And if I find this building here, you can see across the edges what's often known as staircasing, where the edges of the roof sort of take on stepped pixels, which kind of ruins the edge. Well, the anti-aliasing filter will help combat this by softening that. I'll apply it, I'll left click and drag it on top of our clip. Now, as you can see up here in our effect controls, the anti-alias filter works in exactly the same way as the black and white filter, in that it's either on or it's off. There's no degree drag slider that we can use. As I say, it's either on or it's off. With it in place, if you want to toggle it off, click in here of course. I'll switch it back on and I'll take my resolution back to fit, and of course now we don't notice it so much. But what is useful is we get a more softening of those edges by the fact that the anti-aliasing is sort of blurring those edges. Hence that's why it's within this blur and sharpen category. Okay, now I'm going to remove this one as well. I'll right click and run down to clear. Okay, I'm going to finish off here now that we've seen a couple of tutorials looking at the blur and sharpen effects. So with that, I'll leave it and I'll see you in the next one.